All right. Except it's not ready. There we go. Today we will be talking about the episode Projections, which many people tend to consider one of the better episodes of Voyager in general. Definitely one of the best episodes of this season. Probably arguably actually my favorite episode of the season. That's just off the top of my head. There are a couple other very good ones, so this is definitely in the contention. This is the episode in which the Doctor finds out that he may or may not actually be a hologram, may or may not actually be real, and may or may not actually be stuck in the holodeck. It's a very mind game episode, and any of you who have watched Star Trek to any extent know what I mean when I say that. There are several Star Trek episodes that are just mind game episodes. Ironically, several of those were written by the same person, and he's actually pretty good at it, all things considered. Now, whoops, I'm on page 2. I have a couple notes for this one. One of the things I do have to mention, first of all, right at the top here, is that this teaser is perfect. The Doctor's activated. He's like, well, what's going on? Where's Janeway? She's not on the ship. Well, who's in command of the ship? No one's on the ship. And then there's this look of dread that comes on the Doctor's face, just really subtle. And then it's over. End teaser. It's less than a minute. Perfect. Completely gets your attention immediately. Just, oh my god. Now, a lot has been said about the fact that that is basically lying. One of the things I am willing to give this episode is a degree of fairness that it doesn't deserve, okay? I don't know the exact specifics, and I probably never will, but there is a continuity flaw within this teaser and within the first bit of the episode, the lead-up, and it has to do with the overall mystery. And the question is whether or not it is done deliberately or because it's bad writing. I'm pretty sure, like 90% sure, it's just bad writing. But I do want to give it credit. At the very least, it is possible someone pointed it out and they decided to leave it in as a subtle hint. Voyager can be subtle. They will be subtle in a future episode, in Season 2 no less. So, I'll give them that. For those of you who are wondering, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead and basically tell it now. We learn about these series of events of what's happened, okay? The Kazon attacked the ship. There's having a warp core in progress. Janeway has evacuated the ship. She gives a log entry about this event, and then they go and try to fix the warp core breach and barely succeed. And for some reason, Janeway remains on the bridge for this whole period of time. Again, not really making sense. And then at that point in time, a red alert is declared. Now, that doesn't make sense in several ways, and this isn't just me being nitpicky. That's just common, logic and well-established logic within the confines of Star Trek in general and Voyager in specific. So, it is very likely that that was just a continuity error, but I am willing to give them credit for it because I believe that might, even if it wasn't intentional, it does add to the subtlety of this episode. It does add another little clue to the mind game, right? Now I'm going to skip ahead a bit, and by that I mean I'm not going to skip ahead at all. I'm going to skip back. One of the things that happens very well, I mentioned this already, but Picardo is such an excellent actor. He really gets across in his tonality and his facial, just everything he does, his body movement, his expression, and his tone about how much this has hit him. And he's very quiet about it. Most of the time when you say to an actor, any generalized actor, this is just being non-specific here, say, act, despairing. They go, oh my god, they overact it because most people are taught to act, whoa, like that, and there's reason for that. I'm not decrying. In order to be able to act much more quietly and much more subtly is much more difficult to do. It's something I'm not capable of myself, for example, and I'd freely admit this. But Picardo obviously is, and he does put a very quiet, very subtle, just absolute abject despair into his tone and into his movements as he's going through this scene, as he believes that the ship has been abandoned and he is left here completely alone. And as we've already established, being left completely alone is something that bothers him on more than one occasion. It's something that is a problem for him. We've established this more than twice already. So, duh. Now, let's see here. One of the other things I want to add is that this is a suitable build-up to the Doctor's character arc. By the way, real quick, I do know that this and several other episodes were supposed to be Season 1. I'm not going to mention that other than the fact that I just mentioned it right now. They were supposed to be Season 1, they are in Season 2. If anything, ironically, it kind of raises Season 2's overall quality levels to just barely tolerable. And even saying that, that's only because I think one of those episodes, I had a list when I was looking at it. This one is one of those episodes, in other words. And this is a good episode. But this ultimately, all it did was just change where the good was in relation to the bad. And Season 2 has just so much bad that it's probably good that the good was here instead, if you follow me. But anyways, I'm moving on. The build-up with the remote projectors was a really good idea, and something I'll mention in my changes section. I have a very small changes section for this episode. Generally, the Doctor has already had the beginnings of his character growth. I am the EMH. Then he moves forward one step. And this is what I like about the Doctor's character arc, by the way. It is gradual. His next step is, I am a member of the crew. His next step after that is, I am a person. His next step after that is, I am a person who wants to be free. We mentioned this back in Heroes and Demons was the name of the episode, where he goes into the holodeck for the first time. And and I'll get into that more later, but then we have this idea with the remote projectors. The remote projectors idea being overall, even though it was a fantasy, even though it didn't actually happen, spoiler alert, the fact of the matter is it was the writers trying to test out the idea, the waters with this kind of idea and see what kind of people thought of it. And this is something they would eventually start moving into and finally, go with the the thing whose name I can't think of. They talk about its name constantly. Anyways, that thing. So definitely a good step in that direction, even if it wasn't necessary. I also want to point off that on camera, this episode is only the second time he's ever been off sickbay, ever. Now, we can infer that he's been to the holodeck a few additional times since now. And indeed, we kind of find out that that's been true to some extent or another later on in the episode. But nevertheless, I have to give them credit because at this point in time, there is a genuine sense of not quite wonder so much as I want to use the word satisfaction, because that's what Picardo gets across in his performance. He is pleased at the fact that he is able to go to the bridge, about the fact that he's able to go to engineering or wherever, crucial areas of the ship. And there's a great deal of build-up. The scene where they're talking about him going to the bridge is basically written as though it was actually happening. Now, as I've already hinted, spoiler alert, this is your last warning if you haven't watched this episode yet. None of this is actually happening. This is all happening within the Doctor's fantasies court, blah, 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 right? Nevertheless, this one scene is very much written as though it was real, as though they were actually prepping for this to actually happen. And I like that because it puts proper gravitas to what is a significant event. For you and me, walking next door isn't a big deal. For someone who is confined to 2 rooms at this point in time, one of which he has to go under, it's a hassle to reach, and the other one he's just sick to death of, no pun intended, to be able to go next door, in this case, to the bridge or whatever, is a big deal. And so the fact that they ramp it up and he gets there and he's like, I liked that. I liked that quite a lot, actually. And it's funny because this is the part of the episode that feels most real. The next part, I kind of lied. There's actually 3 things that this episode has flawed in it. I've already mentioned one, which is the continuity error. This next one is another example of something I've already talked about in a previous episode, the initiations, which is, in other words, this is going to happen because the plot requires it. However, I am still going to be more lenient in this case because even though it only happened because the plot required it, A, this is a mind game, we've already talked about that, and B, and more importantly, even though it is a mistake, it does actually elevate the overall story because if you look at it as the story rather than as it was designed, if that makes any sense, it does help. It's another clue, basically. It's the second time at which we've seen things are a little bit off. And that is the fact that the Doctor can go to the mess hall. Now, we had this huge, this is giving the episode too much credit, and I know it is. But, not knowing the truth, this does help elevate the episode, because what we just saw is a huge scene of build-up, and okay, we're barely going to be able to work on this, and it's entirely possible it won't work at all, and I may not be able to reinitialize you for like 5 hours, all this stuff. This is a huge deal. Okay, we're going to teleport you to the bridge. Oh God, we're on the bridge. And there's even a few seconds of, smaller or larger than I thought it was. I forget what he says, but, not quite the size I figured it would be. And then he gets on with the story, and then all of a sudden Neelix is like, oh my God, emergency in the mess hall. And then he's teleported there without a second's thought, basically. Now again, not knowing the truth, because that was just bad writing, this actually does emphasize the point of the episode, and it is your second hint. After all that build-up and all that big deal, the mind is left wondering, why is he going to the mess hall so easily and so quickly? And furthermore, why is he going to the mess hall at all? Really, why? Is the mess hall considered to be a priority location for him to have remote projectors set up? You see where I'm going with this? Now, if those of you are out there are probably arguing, well, what Neelix was cooking, which case I have to remind you that Neelix being a bad cook is not funny. I'm sorry. I hate that point, and I want to destroy it with fire. Moving on. One of the things I have to point out, I've already given away the big spoiler, but let me lay it out for you for those of you who don't know. Or rather, I just want to make this point very clear, okay? I've talked before, at length, really, more than once, about how absolutely pathetic the Kazon are, right? We know that this episode is happening because the Doctor's programming and the computer's code are interacting with each other, right? And as I'll mention later, because it's a very important point to the character of the Doctor and the overall plot, the the interaction between the two is is that semi-sentience I've talked about before. Not true sentience, but the semi-sentience that the holodeck and the computer tend to, the ability to be dynamic, almost infinitely, basically, right? Now, I mention that because this is the computer with all its knowledge about everything that the computer knows on all of Voyager, and the Doctor and all his knowledge about everything he knows about, everything that's been happening on the show. And these two, minds basically combine, and what they decide is that the Kazon are so pathetic that Neelix can hold them at bay with kitchen utensils while he's clutching a gun. I don't know how else to say that. I'm sorry, but when even the computer and the Doctor in combined tandem have decided that the Kazon are pathetic, I'm pretty sure we can officially put the stamp seal of patheticness on the Kazon. Thank you. Come again. One of the things I really liked is that the next scene immediately after that was actually written very well, all things considered. The Doctor looks at this injury on Neelix and within a matter of seconds determines that it's not serious and that it's not actually an injury at all. He's just, yep, okay. And he's very clinical about it. His performance is extremely detached, which is what, as many, many, many medical professionals will tell you, is what you kind of have to be when you're actually dealing with someone. You can deal with the emotional baggage later. When you're in the moment, there's nothing there. It's just, okay, this and this and this, right? And I've heard this from many people. I mean, my God, you don't want to hear some of the stories I've heard. And so, what I find interesting and proper about that is not only does that make sense, but then immediately after, he realizes he has an injury and flips out. He completely overreacts and gets to the point of actual panic, and you can hear his tone trembling as he's talking about it. Which is exactly right, because unlike a real medical professional, no offense to the Doctor, I like the Doctor, I'm not just saying, but okay, let me take this back. Unlike a human medical professional who has had injuries, who has gone through pain themselves, this is literally a completely new experience for him. And for the first time in his life, he is feeling pain. Now, I want you to imagine that you have never felt pain in your entire life. Now, granted, in this case, your life is about a little over a year old, but bear with me. For that whole time, nothing, not even a concept. You understand that you want to lower it in other people, but that's basically it. And then all of a sudden, pain, just right there. No warning. Of course you're going to panic. I thought that was very brilliantly done. And I also like the fact that in this episode, we hear the first hint of Zimmerman, who is named after one of the people who actually worked on the show. And he's the guy who Robert Picardo also plays, who is the guy who made the EMH Mark 1. We see him over on Deep Space Nine as well. He actually has a really good episode over there. I like that episode. I can't remember the name of it. It's the one where we found out about the truth about Dr. Bashir, which is all I'm going to say, because I don't want to spoil that. But anyways, I like the fact that they laid that hint, that line for what was going to be fleshed out later very early on here. Season 2. And then I have a note here, which you probably won't be able to read, so forgive me. Yeah, you can't quite see it. It's like right here. There it is. You see that? Barclay! I like Reginald Barclay. He is arguably one of my favorite characters in Star Trek in general. Seriously, I mean that sincerely. And I have to be completely honest, if it wasn't Dwight Schultz playing him, I don't think he would have been anywhere near as interesting. Dwight Schultz, for those of you who don't know, is an extremely talented stage actor, just like Robert Picardo was, just like Kate Mulgrew was, and mostly Picardo, though, because the two of them actually traded shop talk and that kind of thing. But anyways, he is extremely talented, and he is an extremely he has an extremely wide range of acting. He can play. In his very first episode, he plays someone who's completely confident, suave, intelligent, calm, orderly, and then immediately switches to the completely bumbling, nervous, I don't know what to do with my hands, or I don't know how to interact with other people character. In the same episode, in his first episode, knocked that character right out of the park. And I think that he is, in my completely frank opinion, I know I'm talking about TNG here a little bit, so forgive me, he was one of the most human characters we ever saw on TNG. He was flawed, he made mistakes, he had problems, but he was also trying. he also pushed himself to excel, and he ultimately succeeded. If that doesn't spell human, I don't know what does. And admittedly, don't mistake me, TNG certainly stretched out with his characters quite a bit, but in my opinion, most of them turned out to be a little bit too elite, if you understand what I mean, a little bit too perfect. Not actually perfect, if you, I mean, duh, but you know what I mean, right? Barclay was a genuinely human character, kind of like O'Brien was over on Deep Space Nine. That's another good example. He's just a guy, you know, and he's got his own problems and he's got his own difficulties, but he tries to work around them. He was very relatable, and and no, I don't have those kind of nervous issues. In case you're curious, if that's not obvious, I'm actually rather calm and sociable when it comes down to it. Believe it or not, despite my verbal tics and my occasional stutters. But the point remaining here, I've always liked Barclay, and I'm so glad that he keeps showing up. One of the reasons, in fact, that he was in First Contact was because of this episode. Interesting viewpoint. Jonathan Frakes directed this episode. I only mention that because Frakes was so impressed with Schultz acting in this one that it kind of led to Schultz having a bit part in First Contact, which is Jonathan Frakes' first movie directing. And I personally have always liked Jonathan Frakes as a director. I think he does a good job of it. So props there, awesomeness. I get to see more Reginald Barclay, and we get to see the only TNG movie I can say I genuinely enjoyed without hesitation. And yes, I realize I just opened a can of worms by saying that statement. For those of you wondering, yes, I will get the TNG movie or the movies eventually. Not yet, okay? Now, I'm getting way off topic, but that's mostly because I wanted to talk about Barclay. Now, in this episode, obviously, this isn't actually Barclay, and yet we know that this is the memories of the Doctor and the information that the computer has, which is pretty much enough in order to simulate a fairly accurate Barclay. There are only a few moments in which he doesn't act like Barclay, and all of them are done very much on purpose. I'll get to those specifically. But what I'm trying to get across here is that Robert Picardo, Dwight Schultz, win. You know? This was just, oh my god, yes. I remember when this first episode first came out and I was watching it, on TV, on UPN, that's what it was, and just watching the channel, all of a sudden I see Dwight Schultz pop up, and I'm like, yeah! Except my mother's like, calm down. Because we tended to watch it together. We got together for Voyager stuff, because, we're both geeks like that. It was awesome, though. One of the, and I put a couple of notes in here about his performance and how well he does. One of his is almost happens immediately. He says, okay, and he starts panicking and he starts running around. He starts twitching, and he's rather subtle about it. He's not like, oh my god, I'm panicking. He's just okay, and then he turns to the Doctor and says, don't panic, and he goes back to panicking. I love that. That's so Barclay. It's awesome. I'm trying to think of what to next, because everything from on the rest of the page, and this page as well, is all basically the same point. So I'm just going to kind of wrap it all up in one big thing, okay? This is like the last half of the episode summarized. Forgive me. I like the fact that the problem escalates visibly. It noticeably gets worse as the episode goes on. Things get more and more disconnected with how they should be, and this process continues to get worse as things go on. From the crew becoming holograms to Barclay showing up to the whole "you're actually a person" thing, et cetera, et cetera. And then the pain starts showing up. All of these things tend to get worse and worse and worse as the episode goes on, and I like that. It's very indicative of what's happening. As we learn in the future, there's a literal feedback loop going between the two programs that I just mentioned earlier, and that, for those of you who understand what that would mean in terms of programming, first of all, you'd understand that wouldn't actually happen because, duh. But again, let's leave that aside. If two programs of this level of complication were allowed to feedback on each other, that would oscillate out of control very quickly. And indeed, we find out that it basically has. Over the course of this episode, which is not very long, he basically goes psychotic over the course of 40 minutes. That's pretty bad, all things considered. And it was reaching the point where he was almost going to be destroyed. Now, as that problem grows, I want to take a side note here. Skipping ahead a little bit, there's a scene where Barclay is thinking about how to convince the Doctor that what he's saying is true, that the Doctor is in fact a flesh and blood person, right? He resets the program to when things first happen. The Doctor's like, delete Paris, delete Harry, and then people are like, yeah. And then Harry, and technically, several sites have listed this as another example of, at least in theory, of Harry Kim dying. There's actually a tally of how many episodes Harry Kim has died in. It's more than you'd think. Anyways, but then he goes to engineering, and Janeway's there. Now, I mention this because this will be a recurring element throughout the entire series. When Janeway is approached with something unusual or out of the ordinary, she gets really defensive, really aggressive about it, really volatile is the word I would use, and she basically starts barking orders. I want answers, and I want answers now. One of her exact quotes in a later episode, whose name I don't recall right now, is, I don't care if the entire space-time continuum is going to unravel. I want to know why you're on my ship. Yeah, and this is a very recurring trait. I just have to mention this because this is one of the things I like the least about Janeway as a character. I'm sorry, but this is Star Trek. Odd things have been happening since, the beginning. Since this show existed. Since this series existed. Since this setting came into fruition. So, the fact that you're all can almost by definition only make things worse. I cannot picture any of the other captains acting in such a brash, arrogant, childish manner, with the possible exception of early season 1 Picard. And as I've mentioned before, and as I will discuss whenever I finally get to TNG, that wasn't Picard. So, what is your problem, lady? Just thought I'd mention that. Now, there's a note here that I'm going to go ahead and kind of skip ahead a bit. The semi-sentient computer thing is what basically makes this whole episode possible when it comes down to it. I don't mean just literally. I mean, the fact that it can react dynamically to the changing circumstances is why it is so convincing. Barclay himself, the core of everything that is happening within this episode, is in Barclay constantly trying to convince the Doctor, and he keeps escalating. He keeps escalating. Every time the Doctor tries to disbelieve him or thinks of a way around it, the semi-sentient computer, which is creating the simulation within correlation with his own circuits, which, as we already mentioned, are either semi-sentient or literally sentient, basically is upping the scales. And when you have a system that complicated, the problem is the fantasies it can create are so real because they can adapt to just about any circumstances and have a vast wealth of knowledge to pull on that there is effectively no way to disprove them. And that is one of the things that comes across in this episode. We see the Doctor constantly being like, no, I don't believe it, no, I don't believe it, no, I don't believe it. But each time, his statement, the way Picardo says the word, changes just a little bit, so that if you were actually to listen to his first time, be like, no, of course not. It's completely dismissive. By the time you get to the end of it, he actually believes it, he just doesn't want to. You follow me? He has actually already been convinced. He is just still hesitant. He is still worried. He is still scared, and for good reason. And by the end, he's so resigned because he can't think of any other reason to pull back. And he's wanted to agree with Barclay this whole time. And that is the gem of this entire episode. And the ultimate reason why I love this episode. This entire episode is the Doctor, as he is right now, in a nutshell. I wrote down a quote, if you'll forgive me. Barclay, fake Barclay, says this to him. You don't have memory circuits. You have a mind. That summarizes so much of the Doctor at this point in time. And this is why Barclay tries so hard, constantly, to convince him of this, because the Doctor himself wants to believe it. He wants to be a real flesh and blood person. And that point, I'm sorry, I'm actually tearing up a little bit, because that point is beautifully counteracted by Chakotay's point. Definite props on making Chakotay the one to give this speech, by the way. Beltran does this beautifully. I actually wrote it whole down because I wanted to share it with you, if you'll forgive me. Just because you are made of projected light and energy does not mean you are any less real than someone of flesh and blood. It doesn't matter what you're made of. What matters is who you are. You are our friend, and we want you back. I love that line. And it is so beautiful because it is such a perfect counterpoint to the entire rest of the episode. The whole episode is the existential self-dilemma that the Doctor finds himself within. Am I real? Am I a person? I want to be like you. I want to be real. I want to be a being. I want to have this family thing that I know exists. Well, one of the comments that I've heard made is that the Doctor has an infatuation or a romantic feelings for Cass. I've never actually felt that's true personally. The fact that the computer program, I'll discuss it in a minute, but that the fact that Kes shows up as his wife is simply because he knows that's what people have. Her as his daughter wouldn't make any sense particularly, and her as his sister would make even less sense. So it had to introduce Kes in a personal relationship that the Doctor understands peripherally, but does not understand personally, something he wants to have. Not a wife, a personal relationship with another being that you, in his opinion, can only have if you are a real being. You understand me? Now, I mentioned, I was going to talk about that later. Scroll back here a little bit. His this is I was talking about the dynamic thing and the reason and the fact that the program keeps escalating, the fact that the desire to contradict, his every obstacle is it just keeps pulling up. When Chakotay finally manages to communicate with him, the computer ups the ante by bringing Kes into it. That's why that's the moment at which she shows up, because that's what the whole program has been doing the entire episode, is escalating until finally it brings in that personal connection and shows him his fantasies made flesh, so to speak. It is the ultimate temptation, the thing that you want most. It's a hard thing to deny. And what we see in this is what the Doctor wants most. And that makes Chakotay's counteraction all the more powerful. I mentioned there's a scene where Barclay doesn't act like Barclay. It's when he leans down and he tells, in this horrible tone that is just beautiful in its brutalness, he says, "Is that what you want to be? Do you want to be some emergency medical hologram confined to a sick bay and trapped on some ship thousands of light years from home, alone and with no point in..." And he just really puts the point across, and it's very perfect. His performance of it is perfect, and what immediately follows that is Chakotay's speech that I just gave, and that's another reason I love it so much. It is such a perfect counterpoint to everything. Now I'm basically done. This episode is awesome. It has one huge flaw that prevents it from being one of the best of the series, in my opinion, and that is the next scene. I hate it when stories do this. I know I'm not alone. It's called the fake out. Alright, we're in this thing and I don't know what's real and what's not. Oh my god. Oh, okay. We figured out what's real. It's all good. No, it's not real. Oh my god. I hate that. I hate that so much. The only time I've ever seen that done right, ever, this is off the top of my head, is Deep Space Nine, with regards to Sloane's last episode. That's all I'm saying. Those of you who know the series know what I'm talking about. That's the only time I've ever seen the fake out done well at all. And even then, I remember rolling my eyes at the time, because I hate that as a literary trope, I guess, basically. And in this case, it completely and utterly undermines the episode. It adds nothing. It's literally just a, whoa, it's all fake kind of a thing. That's really where it's coming from. And it even does the focus perspective camera as like, oh my god, what's going on? It's all weird. And then we get the same exact technobabble explanation as to what was happening again, even though we just got it a few minutes prior. You could literally eject that whole fake-out scene, and I think the episode would be improved by that change alone, and I mean that. It's like eating a really nice pecan pie that has a rotten cherry. Or no, a rotten... that has a clump of fur in it, okay? And I explain it in this way because as much as you enjoy the pie, once you get to that clump of fur, especially since you can't really get around it, especially in the case of the episode, unless you literally skip forward, it's just going to ruin the rest of it. You're going to be like, ugh, and you're not going to remember how good the pie was. You're going to remember that clump of fur. This is, I suppose you could call this the Mass Effect 3 effect. That is to say, it doesn't matter how good the rest of it was, even though I would contest that Mass Effect 3 was not a great game to begin with. Once you have that clump of fur in your food, guess what you're going to be thinking about? And that's the same effect in this episode. I still think this is a great episode. It's just, I skip that scene every time I watch it now, because it's just, ugh. I watched it for this review just to remind myself and to reiterate that I was correct, and my opinion hasn't changed at all. But anyways, I have enjoyed this episode both then and now. Absolutely, it's a fantastic episode, other than the fur. Changes. As I mentioned, there are very few changes I would do here, and most of them are almost cosmetic. You know me, I like to lay lay a foundation. I like to do foreshadowing. This would be foreshadowing for the Doctor, believe it or not. I would have them actually, instead of him just deciding to go do a holo novel in order to start all this thing, I would mention that what started all this thing was they actually were working on trying to expedite the speed with which he can transfer and give him power to transfer himself to and from the holodeck. Because if you'll remember, back in Heroes and Demons, transferring to and from the holodeck was there, as opposed to zoom, and we'll see zoom later on in the series. So I would say that's what they were working on, and I would have them mention that they were working on the remote projector thing, and mention. I would want this mentioned somewhere that they weren't just doing it to get the medical access to other parts of the ship, that they understood the Doctor's desire to get out of that sick bay, and that this was something that they were doing for him, trying to help out their friend. If you understand where I'm going with this. And that is one of the reasons and that's basically it for all intents and purposes. I would, of course, eject the fake-out scene. There is no need for that at all. And I would change some of the background to it. And that is effectively it. That's the only change I would make to this episode. I think this is a very good one, and I definitely am glad they brought Dwight Schultz in. I wish they brought him in more, but at least we start to see him more often in season 6 and 7. Way down the line, but hey, whatever. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut this off here and take a bit of a break now that I have some videos covered up. Yay! So I'll talk to you guys later.